Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into something that's, well, genuinely reshaping our global map and challenging established norms. We're talking about BRICS.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're wondering what that acronym stands for, it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
That was the original 5, yeah.
Right, the original group. Formally came together around 2009, and then South Africa joined in 2010. So our mission today really is to understand why this group of nations matters so much, especially, how it's challenging those traditional global power structures and really influencing the world of currencies.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here, I think, is that BRICS isn't just another economic acronym you might scroll past. It represents a significant, quite deliberate push towards what they often call a multipolar global order.
Multipolar, so not just one dominant power.
Exactly. Imagine a world where power isn't concentrated in, say, one or two hands, particularly not just with the United States, but it's distributed among multiple influential centers. Their core goal, really, is fostering cooperation among these emerging economies and actively encouraging this kind of multipolar system.
So whether you're someone closely tracking global finance or maybe trying to understand shifts in international trade, or maybe you're just curious about who really holds the power strings these days, what does this all mean for you? Because, the ripples of these shifts, they eventually touch everyone, don't they?
They absolutely do.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting, I think. BRICS isn't structured like the alliances we might usually think of. It's not like NATO, which is clearly a military pact, or even the EU, which is, much deeper political and economic integration.
Right, much more formalized.
Exactly. Instead, BRICS operates more as a geopolitical and economic bloc, maybe a forum for coordination, shared goals. But what are its true aims? What's the real driving force here?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, BRICS fundamentally aims to challenge the long-standing Western dominance within global institutions. Think about places like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, or the World Bank.
Right. Institutions set up post-World War II, largely reflecting, Western interests at the time.
Precisely. They've historically reflected the perspectives of developed Western nations. But, and this is crucial, BRICS actively promotes economic cooperation and trade using local currencies.
Ah, okay. That's a significant shift, isn't it? Moving away from the typical reliance on the US dollar for almost everything international. So they're not just complaining about the system, they're actually trying to build an alternative.
Exactly. And they have several key focus areas that really demonstrate this ambition. First off, there's development financing.
Okay.
So instead of exclusively relying on the IMF or World Bank for loans and development aid, BRICS created its own alternative, the New Development Bank, or NDB. It was established back in 2014.
The NDB. Okay, so their own version of the World Bank.
Sort of, yeah. Think of it like this. If the IMF and World Bank are the traditional lenders, often seen as representing, Western interest or imposing certain conditions, the NDB is BRICS' answer. It's their own bank to fund infrastructure and sustainable development projects, primarily within member states, but also other developing countries. And potentially offering different terms, maybe avoiding some of those conditionalities often tied to Western aid.
Right, so they're not just talking about changing things, but actively building the infrastructure for that change. And this push for kind of independent financial structures leads us right to the next point you mentioned, reducing dollar dependence.
Precisely. That's their second major focus.
Yeah.
Trade and investment. They are, I'd say, aggressively encouraging trade among member states and also with other developing nations using their own national currencies.
So India trading with Russia in rupees or rubles, or China with Brazil using yuan or real, that kind of thing.
Exactly. This is a direct strategy to lessen reliance on the US dollar for international transactions. And it's not just a sort of handshake agreement either. It often involves setting up things like bilateral currency swap lines between their central banks, which effectively lets them bypass the dollar for those specific transactions. They're slowly building an alternative financial plumbing, if you will.
Alternative plumbing, I like that.
And this objective, reducing reliance on the US dollar for international trade, it's really a central and, frankly, very ambitious move, particularly for members like China, India, and Russia, who've been quite vocal about wanting greater economic sovereignty.
And it sounds like a deliberate move towards, financial self-reliance or at least less dependence. But it's not just about the money, is it? You mentioned global governance, too.
Absolutely. It's broader than just finance. Their third key area is global governance reform, BRICS nations have pretty consistently pushed for reforms within major international bodies. You think the UN Security Council, the IMF again, the World Bank again.
They want more say, basically. Essentially, yes. They argued that these institutions need to better reflect the current global economic and political realities, where emerging economies like India, China, Brazil play a much larger role than they did when these systems were first set up, 70 plus years ago.
Makes sense.
And this push supports greater multilateralism and what they often call South collaboration among developing nations themselves.
Okay, so that sets the stage for what BRICS is trying to do. Now, you might be wondering, why does a group like this make countries like the U.S. sort of sit up and take notice? Is it purely fear, or is there something more strategic at play? Because when you talk about shifts in global power, every major player pays close attention.
That's a really important question. And I'd say the U.S. isn't scared or angry in like an emotional sense. That's probably the wrong way to frame it. But BRICS does present a significant strategic challenge to American influence and, well, the existing international order. There are clear geopolitical and economic reasons for this strategic caution rather than, say, outright panic. Okay, so what's the primary concern then from the U.S. perspective? What's number one on that list?
Number one, and arguably the most significant, is the challenging of dollar dominance.
Right, we touched on that.
Exactly. BRICS nations, and you see key players like China, India, and Russia really leading the charge here, are increasingly advocating for trading in their own currencies. This is a direct challenge to the U.S. dollar's role as the world's primary reserve currency and, the preferred medium for international trade.
And why is that such a big deal?
Well, a reduction in dollar dominance could seriously weaken America's global economic grip. It could affect its ability to borrow cheaply on international markets, and it could significantly reduce its power to impose economic sanctions.
Because sanctions often rely on controlling access to the dollar system.
Precisely. They often rely on the dollar-centric global financial system. Imagine if countries could simply bypass the dollar for a large chunk of their trade. It would fundamentally alter the dynamics of global finance.
So it's not just about trade convenience. It's about that foundational financial leverage. And you mentioned they're building their own structures too, the NDB. That must also concern the U.S.
Exactly right. It leads straight to the second point. Alternative global institutions. By creating bodies like the New Development Bank, BRICS reduces the dependence of developing nations on those existing Western-led financial bodies like the IMF and World Bank.
It gives them another option.
It gives them another option, yes. And it's not just about offering an alternative loan. It's about potentially shifting economic power away from the West towards these emerging economies. Plus, these new institutions can set different lending standards or priorities, perhaps better reflecting the needs and values of the global South.
Okay, so we have the dollar challenge, the alternative institutions. But this isn't just economics, is it? There's a definite geopolitical angle here.
Oh, absolutely. The third reason for caution is geopolitical rivalry. Let's be frank. Within BRICS, nations like Russia and China are direct strategic rivals to the U.S. and its allies.
Question there.
So BRICS provides them with a crucial platform. A platform to strengthen their own influence, to build alliances among global South countries, and maybe present a united front on certain international issues.
And what about India? Where do they fit in this geopolitical picture?
That's a great point. For a country like India, a major rising economic power, BRICS serves as a really significant platform too. It helps ensure that global economic policies aren't solely dictated by Western powers. It allows them to carve out their own sphere of influence and articulate their distinct interests on a global stage alongside other major non-Western players.
So a platform for influence for multiple key members. And they weren't stopping at 5 members, were they? There was a lot of talk in 2023 about bringing in even more countries. That could really shift the balance.
That's right. That expansion is the fourth point. Countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia. They were actively considered, and some have now formally joined or are in the process.
Wow, that's quite a list. Some major energy players in there too.
Exactly. Yeah. This potential for a larger, more resource-rich, and let's say potentially non-Western aligned bloc. Well, it poses a significant challenge to the unipolar world order that's largely existed since the Cold War ended. A larger BRICS could command even greater economic weight, control more critical resources, and project more diplomatic power collectively.
Okay. So ultimately, all these factors, the currency challenge, the institutions, the rivalry, the expansion, they all combine to point towards one major concern for the U.S., right?
Exactly. The fifth and final point is that ultimately BRICS openly supports and advocates for a multipolar world, which, by its very definition, implies a decline in American supremacy across politics, economics, and diplomacy.
A less U.S.-centric world.
Precisely. From the U.S. perspective, this means a weakening of the U.S.-led global order, an order which, from their view, has underpinned international stability and prosperity for decades. It's not about an immediate collapse, obviously, but maybe a gradual erosion of influence.
Okay, that makes sense. So, to kind of put it simply, we have BRICS pushing for these pretty ambitious goals and the U.S. viewing those goals with, as you said, strategic caution. They understand the potential long-term implications. Maybe we can quickly sum up those key areas again, just contrasting the BRICS aspirations with the U.S. concerns.
Sure, that's a good way to look at it. So on currency, BRICS aims to reduce U.S. dollar dependence, mainly by promoting trade in local currencies. The U.S. concern, dollar dominance being challenged, which, as we said, underpins so much of its power.
Right.
Then development financing. BRICS is building its own institutions, like the NDB. The U.S. sees this as direct competition to the established IMF and World Bank, potentially diluting Western influence there.
Okay.
Next, global governance. BRICS wants reform of the UN, IMF, World Bank to better reflect today's world, the U.S. perspective. A potential reduction in Western institutional power within these crucial bodies.
Got it. Geopolitics.
Geopolitically, BRICS supports a multipolar world, a more distributed power structure. The U.S. sees this as a direct challenge, potentially weakening American global dominance and its ability to shape international norms.
And finally, the alliances, the expansion.
Right, alliances. Mm-hmm. BRICS is actively inviting more global South countries to join, expanding its influence. The U.S. is cautious about the emergence of a potentially large cohesive bloc that could consistently oppose Western policies and create alternative centers of global power.
But, and this is important, I think, it's not all smooth sailing for BRICS itself, is it? I mean, there are significant internal dynamics, big differences that maybe prevent it from being this perfectly monolithic force. It's not like these 5 or now potentially 11 or more countries are all perfectly aligned on everything.
Indeed. That's a critical point of nuance. While BRICS definitely has significant potential to reshape the global order, it's also limited by internal differences and, frankly, complexities. You have, for example, the long-standing and sometimes tense border dispute between India and China. That's a major fault line.
Yeah, that's huge.
You have very diverse political systems, democracies like India and Brazil, alongside more authoritarian regimes. You have vast economic inequalities among members, with China's economy just dwarfing most of the others. All these factors create friction and can slow down consensus.
So these internal divergences, these complexities, are maybe why the U.S. position is strategic caution and not, as you said, outright panic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's precisely why. While key players like India, Russia, and China are often at the forefront of those de-dollarization discussions, for instance, their individual motivations, their timelines, their approaches can sometimes differ. This can lead to slower progress on some fronts than a truly unified bloc might achieve.
Okay. So despite these internal complexities, the potential is still there. The potential for BRICS to reshape the global order, particularly if it keeps growing, if it gains more influence, and especially if its major players like India, Russia, and China continue that push for local currency trade. That potential is very real. It seems like a group that's definitely here to stay and will keep evolving.
I think that's fair to say.
Wow. What an illuminating deep dive that was. We've really unpacked the ambitious goals of BRICS, haven't we? From challenging Western financial dominance to actively trying to reshape the geopolitical map. It's clear this group is far more than just, a footnote in global affairs. It's a significant force demanding attention.
Absolutely. And remember, listening to this, you've gained some crucial insight into that ongoing push for a multipolar world and how efforts like promoting trade in local currencies could actually impact everything from global trade flows right down to the fundamental balance of economic power. This isn't just abstract geopolitics. It has very real implications.
So let's bring it back to you, the listener. What does this all mean for you? If the world truly does move towards more of a multi-currency system, less reliant on one single dominant currency, how might that shift affect global trade? How might it affect your own investments, perhaps? or even the cost of goods you buy every day. And maybe think about this. What role do you think nations like India, Russia, and China will ultimately play in defining this new economic and geopolitical landscape that seems to be taking shape right now? Something to ponder.